Hello and welcome. In this video, I'm going to show you how you can use Pear Deck to support and build a variety of literacy skills. So Pear Deck is an interactive presentation tool. It basically makes any Google slideshow presentation that you're using with your students one where they can interact and respond, and you can insert prompts so they don't have to navigate off to other places, but you can really have them answering prompts as you're presenting. So it's pretty seamless, encourages a little bit more active listening and participation in a presentation. But to take this a step further, you can also use Pear Deck to help students analyze resources, build their writing skills, and really help them critically read primary sources, secondary sources, or any type of textbook text that you're sharing with them. So this is really helpful for social studies, but it's also great for ELA and even science and some of the other subject areas. So the idea behind this is that you use Pear Deck to basically make any type of slide where you'd put in text from a primary source or a textbook. And students have tools using Pear Deck where they can highlight words, they can write their own little comments. So it basically gives them a way to digitally annotate and analyze the text all in one place. And if you're thinking, well, I like to do this on paper, you can definitely still do this. But the benefit of at least providing this as an option to students here and there from time to time is that with Pear Deck, as the teacher, you can see in real time what they've highlighted, what they've written all on one screen, and can quickly give feedback and input and discuss that right in the moment in class. Whereas if they're all writing on different pieces of papers, that certainly can work, but it just makes that real time feedback piece a little bit more difficult, and you don't get as much collective information from them. Definitely can still have paper as an option, but this could be something you can use from time to time if you want to check out another way of doing this. So first things first, make sure that you have installed the Pear Deck add-on. It's in the Chrome Web Store. You should have it set up already for you where it uses your BCSC Google account, and all BCSC staff have access to Pear Deck Premium this year. So this is just my little informational slideshow that I'm linking in this video. But basically what we're going to do is make a Pear Deck slide. And when I say make a Pear Deck slide, you make your Google slide, you add all the text that you usually would, but we just make sure that we add a Pear Deck prompt to it. So what I did on this one is I am a former social studies teacher, so I did put some social studies examples on here, but I did crowdsource some ELA examples as well, and even younger grade level like elementary and middle school on here too. So what I have on here is a primary source, and this is from a U.S. history class. This would be from the 1930s, 1920s, the Dust Bowl era. The source is linked there. And let's say that this is something that I would usually just print out and give to students, or I would have it on a Google Doc, but I'm making this a little bit different. This original form of this document is 2 pages long. So I already made this a little bit different for my students by chunking this into a smaller section, into 2 paragraphs versus the whole entire document. That's one benefit of doing this with Pear Deck, is that you can take some of those longer texts and break them down into more manageable pieces for your students so they don't feel as overloaded, they don't feel as intimidated by this, and they can work through it piece by piece. And the way that you would break this up is basically just putting this into different slides. So I copied the text from that primary source and just put it in here as a text box. All right, and so my instructions that I put here are for my students to highlight the key points on this text and then illustrate the meaning of what they think this text is trying to tell us using the drawing tools on Pear Deck. So if I kind of zoom out of my presentation here, if you notice, I have a little Pear Deck button here at the bottom. That didn't appear there magically. All I did was go to my add-ons menu and I opened Pear Deck. You have to have this added first, so that's why I linked my intro Pear Deck info here. And then all I did is over here on the right-hand side of the screen, I have some question options. Now, I'm not going to go to the Pear Deck template library because I built this slide myself. And if I select a Pear Deck template, it's going to add that as a separate slide. I just want to make this slide I already built one that's interactive with students. And it has to have this little Pear Deck bar at the bottom of the screen for them to be able to interact with this. If I delete this by accident, they won't be able to do anything with this slide anymore. So what I did is I actually selected a drawing slide, and I will give you a tip here. This is probably the most helpful slide if you're wanting to do this type of annotation activity, just because it's the most flexible. Your students have pencil tools, they have highlighting tools, and they still have a text tool, so they can do free response, highlight, annotate all in one. If you do only the text, then all students can do is type. They won't be able to write out, they won't be able to highlight on the written text. If you do any of the other options here, it's going to make a multiple choice or a drag and drop, which isn't necessarily what I wanted my students to do on this example. So I just did draw, and it added this toolbar here at the bottom of the screen, and I moved mine down a little bit so it wasn't covering this, but that doesn't affect the student's ability to do this. So a few other examples I put on here. Again, another primary source, made that a drawing slide. In this one, I actually put questions off to the side that I want students to answer in addition to highlighting this. So just went through my same process here, wrote everything out, put some text box questions there, and they're all set. And this one even has, this is more of an ELA example, but those are just some examples of slides that I built. Now, if you're wondering, what does this look like for the student? So this is the teacher view. If you ever want to see what this looks like as a student, I would pull up another browser tab or another device, and basically you can join your session as if you were a student yourself and trial run this before you actually have students do that. There's a great post by Jennifer Gonzalez on the Cult of Pedagogy where she talks about dog fooding your lessons, where you try out your lessons before you deliver them to students. In a perfect world, we'd have all the time to do that, but this can be something you can do really quickly. It doesn't take a whole lot of time to do. So when I am ready to use this with my students, or just to even show you what this looks like for them, I'm going to click Start Lesson, and it has some of my settings here. And for this one, I'm going to do a instructor paced activity, which basically means that this is a live session and my students are going through this and I'm determining the pace of that as the instructor. If it's student paced and its students are working at this at their own pace, this is a good idea if you want them to work on this offline, when they're not in your class. When you're not necessarily doing this all together, maybe it's good for a homework option or something to do over an extended period of time. All right, and I'm just going to change one setting here before we do this. All right, so start the lesson. We're going to do instructor paste, and then another tab on my computer, I'm going to join this session as a student. So I have my teacher tab here, and it's launching my presentation. All right, so we're going to go to joinpd.com, and that's the code we're going to enter here. It always gives you a fun little mnemonic device to remember this session. IWT. All right, I'm joining as a student. While that's loading, I'm going to toggle back to my teacher slide. Whenever I'm on my teacher slide here, it will tell you how many students are connected. I have one, it's just me. Whenever I'm ready, I can just do continue. You could also have students join this by just putting a link in your It's Learning course or wherever you're posting this lesson. So I'll click continue. All right, so I'm presenting this and this is live. This is the screen that my students will see. So if I'm gonna go over to my student tab, sorry, I keep going back and forth. This is what I see as the student. So I see my text here, and by default, it's usually set on the pencil tool. But if I want to switch to highlight, I can. And the difference here between pencil and highlight is the highlight has a little bit more opacity, so it's easier to see through the color choices that you select. All right, so I'm going to highlight what I thought was important. I can also change the opacity if I want as well over here and change the size. If I want to erase any of that, I can, if I didn't like the way that looked. But I can come back here. If I want to use the line tool, I can also use the line tool. But I'm just going to mark up all of this. All right. And I'm discovering that I probably, as a teacher, should have made this font a little bit bigger so my students have a little bit more ease of use. So that is something that you will learn as you do this, is that it might be helpful to kind of change the font size so students can see this a little bit easier. And I'm not very good at drawing very straight lines. So I have that set up. And then over here is where I can add in a little illustration of what this text is meaning. So this text to me is saying that there's not very good crop growing conditions. So I can type that out if I want to. And once I add that, I can move it around. I can adjust my text box, which is kind of nice. And then I can also add a little picture here of what I think this means as well. So, whoop, wrong tool. So if I want to take out my pencil tool and maybe this is an X mark. I'm going to redo that because I didn't like the way that looked. Maybe this is my little plant here. It's corn because this is Indiana where we're from, or at least where I'm from. So corn is a big deal. And then I'm going to add in that the crops couldn't grow. And I'm also going to show this by adding some raindrops or what is supposed to be raindrops. I'm going to put some X's through that as well. So this would be my student example of what this could be. So this is how the students will interact with this. So on my teacher side, if I come back over here to my teacher account, I can do show responses and I can see my students' work right away. And what's cool is that if I had more than one person who was participating in this, I could see all of theirs at once. I have these options up here at the top of the screen where it's grid layout, or they're all stacked on top of each other. So the benefit of grid layout is you can quickly see what students are drawing and what they're typing. And highlighting, if I did overlaid, I could see, wow, a lot of kids are highlighting the same sections of the text. They're getting the main points. Or if I'm doing maybe a prompt instead where students are highlighting words that are confusing to them, then I can see really quickly, okay, we need to stop and go over this vocabulary before we move on because we're struggling with it. Okay, so whenever I'm finished and I'm ready to move on to this next prompt, I'll just do, and if you notice that was anonymous as well, whenever you do show responses, this is projecting the same screen that your students would see. It never has their answers there, so it's totally anonymous to them. It doesn't make them feel upset if they don't like their answer being on the screen. All right, so here's another question. I'm just going to skip through these. On the student side of things, students can't move to the next prompt until the teacher does. That's the benefit of this live version. All right, so here's a question where I have the drawing tool set up, so they're still highlighting pieces. I made my text a little bit bigger. But over here on this side is where I want them to type out an answer as well. So this is just showing the benefit of using the highlighting tools, but you can also add some guided reading questions here to help students understand the meaning of the text. So this particular prompt that it now advanced to on my student screen, because I'm on student mode again, this is for a upper elementary school social studies context where you're studying classical studies, but it could also be for other grade levels as well if this meets those standards. So if I'm going to go through, I have my highlighting tool ready, and I'm going to highlight key points. So I'm going to go with this one, just because those are key pieces. Whenever I get to the point where I want to answer these questions, I always like to leave a little bit of space in my text boxes just so my students can drag their text box there when they type their response. So I'm going to answer this first question here. What ancient civilization influenced the government system in the United States? All right, so I have my response, and then I get to move this around on my screen. If I want to add another text box, I can. So I just click anywhere else. I still have text selected, and I can type this out. If I wanted to add even more words, I could. I can change the font layout here. You can't change the size per se. On this area, you'd have to click over here, and this is where I can increase and decrease that size. But I can change the size of my text box over here by just clicking and dragging that, and my color. So I have that set up there, all good to go, and that's just showing you another option here on how you can basically insert questions and then see students' responses. And the idea behind the blank space is it helps you as the teacher know that that's where you're going to look for their answers and where they should put their text box as they respond. So if I go back to my teacher view here, I can see my students' responses all in one screen. All right, so that is just a benefit of using Pear Deck for literacy, at least chunking different pieces of text and kind of going through the reading and writing process. This could be really helpful for social studies like I was showing you. Social studies, there's a lot of reading of nonfiction. This would be really helpful if maybe you're doing a primary source activity and reading and thinking like a historian. You have your primary and secondary sources, and at least on the day or part of your lesson where you're going through those, having students do this together, and this gives you that opportunity to kind of identify areas their strengths are, but then also identify areas that maybe they're struggling with and give you a chance to gather that formative information really quickly and share it with them. This could also be helpful in ELA. Obviously, if you're reading a text together as a class, you can break this up, add questions and prompts in, ask them to identify parts of the text that they can use for evidence and a response. I think it would also even be good for science classes too. Maybe instead of just text, you have graphs and charts, and students are answering prompts about that and what they can infer from those graphs and charts. So hopefully this has been exciting for you and just kind of expanding your understanding of Pear Deck and how you can use this in even more ways than just making your slideshows have questions, but as a way to support literacy, reading, and writing. Thank you for watching.